Okay, so another episode, another quick video. We have a tire that's loose in both planes, and I'll show you here real quick. I don't know if the camera will be able to pick this up. Yep. So we have a wheel bearing that is messed up in here. So I got to take the caliper off. I got to take the caliper bracket, and then start undoing the rotor. So just hang out and watch, and we'll see how we do this. Out. Okay. 15. Wow, that wasn't tight at all. Get on there. Okay, just get this back in front of me. Oh yeah. This is probably going to need bearings. Hopefully the spindle isn't messed up. I got to get a pair of cutters. I'll be right back. Okay, I got my cutters, and the only reason why I needed this is so that I can remove the cotter pin. All right, just kind of straighten it up a little bit. I think somebody reused that cotter pin when they did the brakes last. Okay, now for the cage. Now the cage is a castellated nut or cover, nut cover. So it's got, let's see if I can wipe some of that. It's got these teeth here that when you put the cotter pin in, it locks the nut from being loosened. Okay, so we can tell already, just taking that off, our nut is loose. All right, that was too loose. Whoever did this last did not do this correctly. And I'll be honest, we in the industry don't see these very much anymore. So unless you've got some experience, there's a feel to getting that tight and right. So we're going to shake that down real quick. This bearing is destroyed. It's missing a roller. Take that washer off. That bearing is toast. Okay, now what I'm looking for is there wear on the inside of the inner race. And I don't see any, because that's where the bearing slides onto the spindle. And if this inside race turns, it will wear down the spindle. So, and it's bent. The cage is bent on here. Gosh, somebody did not know what they were doing when they put these back on for the first time. You know, if you're gonna work on a car and you come across something you don't know what you're doing, you're not sure of, ask for help. There's plenty of people like me who will give you the information that you need to finish the job. You know? All right, so now what I'm going to do is put the nut back on, and I'm going to slide the rotor off aggressively. And that's what I'm doing, is I'm catching the outer or the inner bearing on the nut, and it's going to pop the bearing out and the seal. We know that we got to put new bearings on this rotor. I got to clean the rotor up to see if the outer races are okay. So this is a 2002 Ford Ranger, and the reason why we have this style bearing is because it's two-wheel drive, so the power only goes to the rear. If we had four-wheel drive, we would probably have a unitized hub bearing assembly where you just unbolt and the bearing assembly comes out. But because this is two-wheel drive, this is old school technology. This is from like 1930 all the way up to the late 2000s. All right, so this is really old technology here. All right, so you saw how I slid that nut all the way in there, and now I'm catching the bearing. So there we are. Okay. So now what I want to do is feel the races. The races feel okay. All right. Now let's try to take a look at this bearing. This bearing looks like it's okay. Now I'm going to tell you all a little secret about me. I hate getting dirty. I know I'm in the wrong profession, but I hate doing these jobs. They're just so messy. They're rag consuming, and it's one of the messiest jobs that you can imagine on a car, next to maybe changing a clutch that's been well used. All right, so I'm gonna clean this up a little bit and clean the inside of this rotor up a bit, and we'll continue on and see what we find. We might be changing this rotor, so we'll be back. Now, what do you look for when you pull these bearings out? Get this right there. Okay, you want to turn it and feel roughness when you turn it, and I don't. And then I know it's hard to see, but you need to grab a roller and roll it over to see if there's any pits in it. Okay, I don't see any pits, so this bearing is okay, feels good. And also look at this side to see if the cage is wobbling. The other side of the cage is all bent up, but this side is all, it's got a nice circle, so that is okay. All right, now we're going to do the same as we did on the other side. Then we're going to grab the rotor, bring it down onto the right in front of the bearing, and then just like that. Now you don't have to do it this way. You can take the rotor off and then take a tool and pop with a tool and grab the bearing out, or the seal, and then pull the bearing out. But that definitely ruins the seal to never be reused. If you do it the way I just showed you, you can potentially reuse the seal, although we won't. So I don't feel any roughness. All right, let's take a, I don't see any pits on this roller. This roller has got a little discoloration, so it got hot at one point, just that one. That's enough to cause it to get replaced. So we will probably replace this bearing as well. So we will probably put new bearings and new rotors on this. This is also a commercial vehicle. It's used for a business, and which is also, I'm weighing in on my decision to replace everything so that they stay in business for a longer period of time. The brakes are half done anyway, so we can throw a set of rotors, a set of bearings, and a new set of pads, and we'll be good to go. All right, so now that we got this side cleaned off, this is where the bearing rides on the spindle, and here. So what we don't want to see is pits or grooves or lines that go around the circumference of the spindle here. All right. If we do, what that means is that the inner race of the bearing is turning, and we don't want to see that. The races stay still, which this is normal what we see. This is a normal pattern right here. So this spindle is okay, and I'm pretty sure the spindle on the other side will be okay as well. All right, so there we go. We're gonna put new rotors, new pads, new bearings on this. I just gotta talk to the customer. We'll be back. Okay, we're back. We had to wait a few hours to all the parts come in. So let's recap what we're doing. Customer came in, complained of something going on with the front end. He wasn't quite sure what it was. I drove the car, it made an ungodly noise. I turned it right around, put the vehicle up in the air, took the wheels and shook them. And both wheel bearings are loose. The left side was way messed up with one roller bearing completely missing out of the outer bearing. So we sold them new pads, new rotors. And the main reason why we're changing the rotors out is because the one bearing was so loose, the rotor was hitting the caliper. The caliper was like this, the rotor was hitting the caliper bracket because the bearing was so loose. So there's a wear on the rotor. So that brings us up to now. So pads, rotors, inner bearing, outer bearing, and grease seals. Okay, so when you order a set of these type of bearing hub rotors, they will come with a race, the outer race, the bearing outer race. So what is the outer race and what am I talking about? So what you have here is the bearing assembly. This part is the inner race. This is the actual bearing. And these are the bearing rollers, and this is the outer race, and they are a match set. Okay, the taper that you see, the cone, is matched to the taper of the outer race. Okay, so they are a match set. You don't want to ever get them, you know, switched around. However, our rotor came with inner bearings. Outer races already pressed into the rotor. Sometimes we can get away with just putting the bearings in it, pack it up with grease and ship it. I've done that, but it's not the ideal thing to do. So that's what we're going to go through. We're going to do the ideal. The problem, or the reason why this may be a problem, is the taper of the outer race that's pressed into the rotor may not match the taper of the bearing. And so if it doesn't match it, then the full surface of the roller will not ride on the race. And so what we're going to do is, even though these are brand new rotors, we're going to punch out the outer races on the outer bearing and the inner bearing. To do that, you need to use a punch. Now, keep in mind, the material that they use is a very hardened steel, and you also don't want to scratch the surface. So you want to use a softer metal, like a brass punch, to punch these races out. And I don't know if my cameraman can get in there, but we're going to try. We'll add a little extra light here. What we want to do is hit right on the edge of that taper bearing race. And we're going to just walk it around and pop it all the way down. Once that's out, then we'll flip the rotor over and do the same thing to the other race. Okay, so here we go. We're at a disadvantage because sometimes, or usually, there's a groove in here that you can get more lip of the race, and we're not getting to that groove. So this might take a little bit longer. So anyway, we're gonna pause while I fight this, and we'll bring it back right when I get it out. Be right back. All right, there we are. So there is the press-in race. So now we're going to flip this over and get the other race out. She's almost out. Make sure we got room for it to fall. There we are. So there's our outer race. Okay, now we need to put the new races on. They're a little bit easier to do. However, make sure you get the orientation right. So we'll go back to this inner bearing. The race has to fit where the bearings are going in. So on the front, you want the back side of the race downward, and on the other side, you want the back of the race going into the rotor so that the bearing taper matches. Very easy to get that messed up. Then you go through all this all over again. All right, so we're gonna clean our surface up. Okay, we're gonna find a socket. Okay. So now we got to press this in. Some guys use a shop press. I have one. It's actually outside, but this will work just as good. Okay, get a socket. The one thing you don't want to do when pressing in is hit the bearing surface. Always make sure that you're pressing against the outer ring. Okay, so my socket will not hit that surface at all. Now, all we got to do is just drive this home. What I'm doing first is making sure that it's going to go in square. And she is now started. So now we just drive it home. All right, it's going in a little crooked. There we are. Okay. I'm going to use my light to make sure that it's all the way in. And she is. What I'm looking for is there a gap between the back of the race and the lip of the rotor that it sits into? And there is no gap. So that race is all the way seated and it's even all the way around. So that's what we want. Another thing you can do if you can't get the socket perfectly fit is take an old race and hammer it that way. You know, so now your socket sits above the edge of the rotor. That's another way of doing that. Okay, so we got the outer race done. Now we got to do the same to the inner race. Okay, we're back. I got a round piece of steel that perfectly fits the edge of the bearing, and now we're going to send it home. We got to square it up first. Okay, it's still a little crooked, but we're getting there. And you'll hear the sound change when it gets all the way down. You'll just hear it. There it is, all the way down. So let me do the next rotor, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about packing bearings and putting the grease seal in. So give me a couple minutes and we'll be right back. It'll be like that to you, but we'll be back. Okay, we are back and we now need to pack our bearings with grease. Now, this is one of those things where I'm going to tell you, do as I say, not as I do. This just happens to be the grease that I have, so this is what I'm going to use. It's kind of okay no matter what grease you use, as long as it's a good high pressure grease if you take all of the grease out. Now, if you're just packing bearings and putting them back in, then you want to try to get the grease that was used before. Again, you don't want to try to cross-contaminate greases. Some greases don't work well with others, but considering we have new rotors and new bearings, we're just using one grease to cover the whole thing. That's what we're doing. All right, so how do we pack our bearings? Now, this is something that the old guys, us, I'm included, love to tell the younger guys, because there is fancy tools to do this, but doing it manually is just kind of like a tradition kind of thing. I have the tool, I didn't find it, so I'm not going to use the tool to pack the bearings. So we're doing this old school by hand. Be prepared, it's a messy job. So we'll start with the big bearings first because they're easier to film. You're going to get a dollop of grease. All right, put it right into your hand. Then you're going to grab your bearing and you want to try to eat the grease into the cage by pressing it onto your skin and just kind of scoop it up. When it starts coming out of the rotors, then you know it's full. Or coming out of the bearing, the rollers, the bearing rollers is what I mean. Okay, so we just grab a little bit and just press it in. Okay, need a little bit on this guy. There. Looks like I got it all the way around. Okay, so there's one. Do the next one. But so we just grab it, just press it in, and you're just smushing it into that cage right around those rollers. I've seen some guys, when they're done, just take a little bit and just rub it around the rollers on the outside of it, just to make sure. Just to make sure that it's fully coated. And then for an extra bit, as I try to pack in some grease from the top. This is just me. You might not have to do this, but this is just, I want to make sure that this bearing is fully greased up no matter what happens. So that part is all full. I'll come back to this guy and do the same thing. Okay. So now you saw me pack two bearings by hand. It took about a minute each. So we're going to do the other two bearings and then we'll come back to the grease seals. So we'll be back in a minute. All right. So I've got all the bearings packed up. Now it's time to put the back or the inner bearings into the rotor so we can put the rotor onto the spindles. Before we do that, because these are completely clean, I'm just going to put a little dollop of grease and just rub it all up inside there. Want to get enough grease that if I happen to do a crappy job, which I didn't, but if I did packing the bearings, there's still some extra grease to try to stave off from the bearing going bad of lack of lubrication. Now that that's done, we're going to take our bearing, our inner bearing, and drop it into the race. Okay, just like that, just like so. Next thing we do is we get our brand new grease seal. All right, now these are pressed into the rotor. So when you go to press them in, you can use a hammer or a socket, but you have to get it on this lip. Not on the very edge though, right at the very inner edge of that lip is where you want it to sit, be sitting or hitting. So I'm just gonna walk it around with my hammer here. There it is. There's one. So that's how we pack and seal our bearings for a rotor replacement on a bearing hub rotor assembly. I got to do one more rotor and then we'll start putting the brakes together up on the front here, and we'll come back when I get to that point. So see you later. Okay, we just got done doing the other side. We're filming on this side. It has a little bit better lighting, but not by much because I've blocked most of it. So I'm gonna have my headlight on so that you guys can see what I'm doing. So the first thing I want to do is clean this spindle up because it may have grease that's incompatible with the grease that I use. So I want to clean it up and just get it clean. Also, we have to remember that the old bearing was all chewed up on this side, and we want to get any grease that contains metal filings out of the way so that our new bearings don't get hammered by it. Now this also gives us a chance to look at our bearing surface. There's a little bit of scoring marks from obviously when the bearing has spun, but it's not too bad. We can still reuse this spindle. And I can see some heat rings, so this side got hot, which is expected because that's the bearing that got all messed up. But it's not enough that we can worry about, or that we have to worry about. So we can reuse this, which is nice. Back to our rotor. We have everything ready. Our inner bearing is in there. Our grease seal is all in place. Our reluctant reel or tone ring, it looks good. This goes past this guy, and that's for the ABS wheeled speed sensor. So now we're going to put this on. Okay. Next goes our outer bearing, all backed and ready to go. Next is our washer, or you can some call it a bearing retainer. Again, I'm cleaning the grease just in case there's any metal shavings in there. We don't want those shavings to mess up our new bearings. And notice it's got slots so it lines up. It can't spin. Okay, so that gets in there. Next is our spindle nut, and same treatment. We're going to wipe this as clean as we can, and that goes in. Now, let's take a moment to talk about bearing preload. All right. I'm going to turn my light off so I can talk to you guys. So, bearing preload is we have to compress this bearing together and kind of seat it in. The preload is too tight for the spindle, okay? There is an actual torque rating where you torque it and set it and then back it off a little bit. You can torque it and set it off and back it off. I've been doing this long enough that it's a feel for me. I just know when it feels right. I've been doing this for 30 years. So we're gonna spin it. We're gonna tighten this up. Okay, get this right. There we go. So, okay, that feels pretty good there. And then we're gonna back it off just a smosh, spin it a little bit, tighten it up just like that. All right, that's it. But like I said, if this is your first time, look at the service manual, because there is a torque set. You torque it down to preload and then you back it off. And this is just really good. It's like butter. Real nice. So next is our Castle or nut retainer or cage. I call it a cage, but again, we're trying to get as much of the old grease off so that there's no metal shavings in our wheel bearings. So we have teeth for deals, and we have to line it up with the hole in the spindle. So that's a little tight. Let's try to not that one, not that one. No, that one looks really good there. So now we're going to put our cotter pin through. The cotter pin keeps the cage from turning, and the cage will keep that nut from turning. Get a cotter key that fits. Don't use one that's too small. If you have to hammer it in, it's too big, obviously. Okay, we're gonna bend this out a little bit. And this is just how I do it. And as I torque forward, it's gonna pull it down just enough to make sure that it's tight. Okay? See, that's tight. So then we just go right back over it. Okay? And then what I do, this part is not necessary, but this is just for me. I trim off the back end of it, and then I'm going to bend it against the cage and tighten it up. Okay, now I know that this cage is locked in. That nut will never come loose. It's just an assurance. Okay, next is the cap. As cameraman Nate just announced, metal shavings in our grease will eat our bearings and our the races, and it will pit the bearings as well, and it'll do it within 100 miles, if that, probably 10 miles. So you want to get all the grease out as much as you can, and the grease that we put in there is more than enough. You don't need 10 pounds of grease inside these things. Just tap it in there. Okay, got a little bit of hole there, not too bad. This cap has been on and off a bunch of times. All right, so we got that settled. Oh, this is good. Nice and smooth, and it's about the same torque as the other side, so we'll have even driving. That's another thing. If you get one side too tight, that side, the tight side, is going to pull. So you want to make sure that your bearing load is the same on both sides. Very important that you get them equal. All right, so next is our bearing bracket or caliper bracket. Notice I'm not cleaning the rotor yet. I'm going to wait until I get stuff on there so that I don't get it dirty after I clean it. Okay. So we are going to clean the rotor. We want it clean. We don't want any grease or fingerprints on this rotor to impact our brand new pads. That can cause a squeak, or it could cause accelerated rear, or it could cause a lack of braking from one side to the other. So got to make sure this is all cleaned up. Particularly, we're concentrating on the face of the rotor. So from this point on, try to make sure that you don't touch the face of the rotor. All right, so these are abutment clips. These are what the rotor or the pads slide on as they're moving. And I notice on the other side they're kind of hard to put on, but we'll get them on. And then we seat them down. There. And okay. So the brake pads that we're using today are Wagner thermal quiets. I've used them in the past. I couldn't get the ones that I normally use, so this is my backup pad. They're an okay pad. I think they're just as good as any other pad. We're going with ceramic, semi-ceramic brake pads. The OE pads were apparently semi-metallic, so this will give them better braking as well as better, it'll be quieter than the semi-metallic. You need to put the pistons into their holes. Now the book or the manual will tell you, open up the bleeder valve. You know, you do what you want to do. I just don't do that. I feel any opportunity of air to get into the system is detrimental to the system. We're not worried about bleeding the brakes, so I don't need to open them up. So again, this is do as I say, not as I do. You do it, you do, and I'll do it my do. Make sure your slides are good, which these are. Okay. All right, now let's address the elephant in the room, or I should say the lift in the room. Why am I doing this on the floor when I have a perfectly good 10,000 pound lift? And I'm glad you asked that question. I will be happy to answer it. The reason is, the frames on the Rangers are narrow, so you have to get the Ranger perfectly centered. And it may take 2 or 3 times to do that. Okay, that's one reason. The other reason is the frames are really weird on the lift points. So they have, if it's 2-wheel drive, you have to lift it up by the frame rail. If it's 4-wheel drive, they have like a landing pad, and you have to get the Ranger at the right distance, or centered, not even centered, but just the right spot to get the pads to reach the rear and the front at the same time to lift it up. It just takes a long time to mess with it and to get it right and perfect. And even then, if there's extra weight in the back, you can't lift it because it's too cantilevered out. I have my lift set forward in my shop, so I can't pull things very far forward onto the lift. So it's just easier for a Ford Ranger to just put it up on jack stands and deal with it on the ground. So that's why. Taking care of it. There. Now, if you've noticed, when I tighten things up, I always do it by hand. That's just old school me. You know, guys can trust the Ooga Doogas. I just prefer to just get the feel for it and tighten it all up by hand. I'll run them down with a ratchet and a gun and whatnot, but when it comes to tightening brake bolts by hand or tightening them up, I just prefer to do it by hand. There. Okay. All right, so we are done. The only thing left to do is put the wheels on, torque them down, and give this a test drive to see if we've solved the customer's complaints. One of the complaints was the ABS light being on. I had already scanned it. It had a code for the ABS sensor on this side. But since there was so much room or movement on this wheel, I needed to make sure that the brakes or that the rotor could sit true before I start diagnosing that sensor, because getting the rotor true might fix that code. So that's the first step. I had to get these done first. The other complaint was there was something weird on the suspension. When I test drove it, I only got it a block before I turned it around, because this was making so much noise, I thought the ball joints were falling out of it. So I didn't want to get stuck on the road. So the next thing for me to do after I put the wheels and tires on it, or put the wheels on, is to take it for a good test drive and see if we've solved some of the problems and just go on from there. So we're gonna cut the video. Thanks for watching. Hit likes, hit subscribe, you know, all that jazz. I'm trying to build my channel so I can start doing some really crazy builds or some charity work. That would be really awesome. That's what I would like to do. And so subscribe to my channel, and we'll see you on the next job. Bye.